Okay. And just to echo the thank yous, I would also like to thank Pablo and Sarah and Shutal for all of their work that they've put into making tonight's event possible. So in the interplay between formalism and informalism, my presentation is going to be a little bit more formal. The NSK State takes the concept of the state as a Duchampian ready-made and merges it with Joseph Beuys's ideas of social sculpture. In repossessing and reprocessing early 20th century utopian idealism as one of multiple elements within its framework, on one level it aims to exist as an ideal form of state, a deterritorialized social organism that provides a conceptual alternative to the politics of alienation generated by contemporary political systems and modern nation states. But unlike other alternative social formations, the signifiers of power and authoritarianism that have characterized the work of NSK and its constituent groups since the formation of the collective in 1984 undercut the utopian principles operating within the framework of the NSK State. In this sense, the NSK State is not only an alternative virtual social formation, but a critical lens through which to view the relationship between art and ideology and the tension between autonomy and hegemony as it plays out in the desire for an actualization of alternative social, political and cultural spaces. As an aesthetic project, it interpolates in real social and political situations, such as the example of the NSK, such as the Nigerian passport holders. The NSK State should not be read as an activist project as such, but as a methodological field in which social relations are explored, tested, and ultimately challenged. The complex geometry of belonging that has shaped the formation, disintegration, and reformation of the modern nation state comes under scrutiny and provocation in the temporary manifestations of the NSK State and in the actions and initiatives of its citizens. And these are some slightly different IRWIN NSK Garda slides to complement the ones that Miran showed. If the NSK State appropriates the utopian desires of early modernism, it also symbolically reappropriates the totalizing narratives of nationalism and repressed authoritarian violence that lie at the roots of the modern nation state. The multiple signifiers deployed by the state include disquieting formations of force, referencing what was referred to during the first NSK Citizens Congress in Berlin as the dark side of history. For example, the symbolic appropriation of multinational armed forces, as carried out in IRWIN's NSK Garda actions, evokes the controlled and ritualized threat of violence that characterizes the modern nation state. Rows of rigid, uniform bodies in military formation echo the physical walls and barriers that represent extreme manifestations of statehood, such as those that enclose and exclude in contemporary zones of contention. And these are two images by Belfast photographer Frankie Quinn, one of the separation wall between Israel and the West Bank, and one of the 41 walls that divides the city of Belfast in the north of Ireland. The defensive bulwark formed by the mechanised body prevents the dissolution of the self in the morass, the miasmic sea of others that constitutes the enemy within as well as without. The uniform body, to paraphrase Alan Feldman, is the body infested and inhabited by the state. The state is internalized to such a degree that it thinks and acts, that its subject thinks and acts in accordance with its implicit and explicit commands. Woven into the virtual and physical manifestations of the NSK State, these signifiers of force function as barricades and commands, indicators of the sociological chains that tie us to abstract retroformations shaped by the historical evolution of capital and the social formations that arose in opposition to it. If the NSK State represents a return to the commons, its incorporation of the politics of enclosure imbues it with a pervasive sense of tension. Within the destabilizing proliferation of the multiple signifiers that characterize the NSK State, the spectres of history, politics and ideology provide a perpetual pull between alternating poles of utopia and dystopia. NSK actions involving uniform bodies and the apparatus of the state maintain and amplify the tension between alienation and attraction that characterizes any relationship to authority. Interestingly, NSK citizen-generated folk art, for the most part, eschews the utopian dynamic present in the NSK State in favour of the dystopian, with the overwhelming majority of such works reprocessing NSK motifs that utilise the language of and aesthetics of power, authoritarianism and totalitarianism. The issue of power poses the perennial conundrum involved in building any alternative society, from the revolutionary liberated zone to the temporary autonomous zone, the commune, squat, or more recently micronation. Artists, of course, are not immune to the seductive allure of power that is unleashed in state-building initiatives. For example, at the end of World War I, Gabriele D'Annunzio, poet, revolutionary, and ultranationalist, established an artistic utopia of his own. In a bold, irredentist move, D'Annunzio marched with an army of demobilized Italian stormtroopers to the Croatian city of Rijeka, then called Fiume, which he seized for Italy. When Italy refused to accept it, D'Annunzio declared the city an independent state, the Free State of Fiume. Music was proclaimed to be the fundamental principle of the state, which during its 14-month existence became home to anarchists, futurists, musicians, bohemians, and mutinous Italian soldiers. D'Annunzio's proto-TAZ came to an end in 1921 when he fled the city under attack from Italian gunboats. Like D'Annunzio, they're operating on a much larger historical stage. Adolf Hitler probably represents the best known example of the albeit failed artist turned statesman. Under his ethnocentric utopian vision, Greater Germany was to become a Gesamtkunstwerk, or total work of art. In the cartoon The Sculptor of Germany, Hitler is depicted as a forceful sculptor, dispensing with the efforts of a quote-unquote degenerate artist to remold the amorphous mass of the population into a steely fascist male body. Cold War polarization, Third World liberation movements, and the waves of social upheaval that swept through the late 60s rekindled the desire for alternative forms of social organization. Alongside the reimagined communities generated by the communal and squatter movements, micronations have rapidly proliferated in recent years. As independent nations or states, which are not recognized by world governments or major international organizations, micronations usually exist as social or political simulations. And this is a coronation of the artist Morten Homfjord as the Viceroy of Fusa, a micronation in Norway. And this is the passport for the Principality of New Utopia, diplomatic passport, and this is the president of Molossia. At the Berlin Congress, discussions took place as to whether or not the NSK state should be considered a micronation. It was argued that the state in time transcends micronations and that they tend to limit themselves to outmoded forms of government, mimicking fiefdoms, monarchies, and other feudal structures. As an all-encompassing meta-state, the establishment of unilateral relations with other macro or micronations was ultimately deemed to be in contradiction to the status of the NSK state as the first global state of the universe. The power of the NSK state lies in its lack of fixed points of reference, its absolutism, yet its open-endedness. Functioning in a similar fashion to Eliszewski's Proun paintings, which according to Victor McGullen denied a fixed perspective and embodied a strong, orderly arrangement of elements, it is within the abstract conceptualization of space engendered by the state that citizens have the ability to collectively recreate themselves as part of a deterritorialized social organism. The existence and proliferation of the NSK state also poses broader questions on how we relate to the collective imaginaries of nation states and territories in an era characterized by globalization, neoliberalism, and crisis. Paradoxically, it is through the volatile clash of multiple and opposing elements that the NSK state provides the possibility of transcending and deactivating contemporary mechanisms of control. The unlimited spatial dimension of the state encourages a dissolution of boundaries, replacing them with a collective flux of ideas which are free to move beyond the constricting parameters of what founding NSK member Edda Schuffer refers to as the cage of national culture. While not a panacea for contemporary social problems, the actions of the NSK state are particularly relevant in terms of the recent development of socially engaged practice and the current Occupy movement. And this is the General Assembly taking place in Zuccotti Park in the fall. Occupy Wall Street has reawakened new flows of utopian desire and its drive to engender radical alternative social formations. The zones of occupation that have sprung up in the wake of the protests also reclaim the impetus of past social movements to test new ways of living. While the Occupy movement relies on the appropriation of space, the NSK state conceptually supersedes nations, boundaries, and territories. And this is the work of NSK citizen David Kay, which reprocesses NSK motifs in relation to the Occupy movement. And David, who also designed the logo that's on the little flyers on the stamp, has a table in the lobby which you can look at after this presentation. So encompassing both the hegemonic totality of the work of its founders and the decentralized initiatives of its citizens, the NSK state constitutes a critical if ambiguous alternative Its evocation of post-national social relations remains prescient in an age of ever-increased sophistication in state control, surveillance, and total information awareness. It is fitting that the passport embodies the NSK State as a document of identification, belonging, and exclusion. The NSK Passport provides access to a complex, hybrid, and provocative zone that ultimately contains the politics of the possible. And embodying a conscious extraction of the individual from the unconscious imposition of ideology, citizenship of the NSK State embraces the possibility of a new collective imaginary, one that confronts with a view to possibly decommissioning the police states that we all carry around in our heads.